Well, it would be helpful to have 1 Samuel chapter 14 open in front of you as we look together at those first 23 verses as Bernie read for us a few moments ago. You can see imposed there on the background we have an image. That is a picture of the cliffs of the valley that Jonathan and his armour bearer climb up. We read, or Bernie read for us that there in the description that Jonathan climbs up with his hands and his feet. And very simply, for those of us who haven't been to Israel and don't understand the terrain as well as some of you who have been there, here is a glimpse of it. And you can tell this valley is not smooth-sided, grassy, soft slopes. It's not an exaggeration when David has to scramble up it with his hands and feet. It is sharp-sided on both edges. You could imagine that Jonathan and his armour bearers, they're climbing up towards the Philistine outpost. They're actually really quite vulnerable and exposed. It just shows how precarious a situation this is, but incredibly as well how bold Jonathan and his armour bearer are, and we'll come to that in a little while. But as we return back to 1 Samuel, having had a substantial break through December and January, let's just remind ourselves quickly where we are. Israel, as God's people, have been struggling to live faithfully for God. There's been a whole series of judges that have come and gone. There's been this constant cycle of following God, serving God, falling away from God, coming under oppression and attack, calling out to God, being restored, and that's been going on and on. And eventually, it gets to the place where the people have called for a king. They've rejected God as being a ruler over them, and they've asked for a king, and God gives them Saul. And his name means asked for. He is the king they've asked for, not the king that they need, but he is the king they've asked for. And the trouble is, what they're starting to see is some of the folly of asking for a king that they thought they wanted rather than the king that they needed. They wanted, remember, a king because then they would be like the other nations round about them. Other nations had a physical king to lead them into battle. They had physical gods that they could go and look at and worship. And the nation of Israel said, our God is in heaven. We can't actually see him. He's not enough. We want something more tangible. Well, we can understand them wanting to have a clearer understanding and firmer grasp and vision of God. The trouble is, in essence, they're saying we don't feel our God is enough. And therefore, in order to be like the other nations, in order to have a figurehead, in order to have an authority that is able to compete with the leadership of the other nations, we need to have something physical that we can see and touch too. And in a sense, Israel therefore picture God's people like us still today, in that sometimes we do look for leadership and identity in the same terms that the world does, and that is always a mistake. And as the people of Israel start to see that, we feel it too, and don't we? In that our brokenness and spiritual haziness can end up descending on us when we stop looking to God alone. What we are here in chapter 14 is that Saul has just been told by Samuel that his dynasty as king is going to begin and end with him. In chapter 13, verse 13, we're told that Samuel says this to Saul: "You have done a foolish thing. You've not kept the command the Lord God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time, but now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's commands." Saul knows his days as king are going to end and fade rather than carry on through the succession of his son. And so what we find here is a king who's really starting down what we know of Saul to be the very slippery slope to end up far away from God. But in the midst of this passage, we have someone else, Jonathan, whose eyes are not on the king, but are still on God's. He's seeing past the physical throne to the heavenly throne. And what we find here in this passage this morning are ways to stop enjoying God and ways to enjoy God. And we'll consider that together with three headings. And the first one is this morning, subterfuge. Big word for a Sunday morning, I know, but really what we're meaning here is, something is being hidden. Something's being covered. There's a scene being painted before us, and it's not quite the scene, and it doesn't show us the reality of what's going on. As we said, Saul knows that his kingdom is going to end. His line is not going to carry on. And what we do find, though, remarkably, is that Saul doesn't actually give up as being king. He does try really, really hard. And even after he gets rejected, we find that Saul, throughout his entire time, at the end of chapter 14, if you look at verse 52, it says there, all the days of Saul there was bitter war with the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service. Saul is constantly acting to defend the people of God, and he's constantly trying to seemingly get it right, or at least do something. But there's a problem and a heart that's missing from it. And we see that right here at the start of chapter 14, where there's this description of where Saul is and what he's doing. We're told in verse 2 of chapter 14 that Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod, and we're told that he was the son of Eli, the priest at Shiloh. There's this incredible scene of the king of Israel sat under a pomegranate tree with a priest who has an ephod, so the means of communicating with God, the signs of office, sat right there with him. And this is a remarkable sight for the people of Israel. And it is fascinating that we are given this detail of a pomegranate tree, because pomegranates are actually quite significant. We're not exactly told and given the precise details why, but pomegranates were used as decorations, or little models of them were made and used as decorations on the priestly garments. God told them to be made and put on the garments of priests. You can read about that in Exodus chapter 3, verses, it's not chapter 3, isn't it? It's going to be 23, or verse 24 to 26. And then we also find in Deuteronomy chapter 8, when God is talking about the promised land, just turn briefly there, Deuteronomy chapter 8, and then if you look in Deuteronomy 8 and then find verse 8, we'll read from verse 7. This is what will happen if the people obey God. God says to them from Deuteronomy 8 verse 7, "For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks, streams and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing." The pomegranate fruit there is used as part of the description of saying this land that God is bringing the people to is a land of blessing and plenty. It is a land that is fruitful. The pomegranate tree, therefore, was part of the sign, and the abundance of it within the land was part of the sign of God's blessing and kindness to his people. In fact, you can read later on in the books of Joel and Haggai, so it's Joel chapter 1 verse 12, Haggai chapter 2 verse 12. They both there reference pomegranates again as being a sign of wealth and prosperity and blessing within the land. And so we have the king sat here under a pomegranate tree, and it looks like, for all intents and purposes, this is the king with blessing, prosperity, and more than that, we find him with who? Ahijah, who is a priest. It's the great-grandson of Eli. Unfortunately, though, as we remember back to when we were thinking about Eli and a few chapters back in 1 Samuel, Eli was told that his priestly line was going to end, that he'd been cut off and rejected too. And so what we have here is a king with a rejected dynasty who seeks out a priest from a rejected dynasty, but yet some former claim to authority. And he is a priest, though, still. We're not told that he's a discredited priest or a cut-off priest. He is still a priest. But he's there under the tree. And there's this obvious symbol of God's blessing and peace and presence being with Saul, a king who knows that actually his relationship with God is going to come to an end. It is broken. His line is no longer under God's blessing. And this seems to be Saul wanting to create and paint the picture, because anybody from Israel, as they look on that scene, they're going to say, wow, isn't that a lovely sight? There's the king with all the signs of God's blessings and promise and provision and peace and presence. Shouldn't we take heart? Trouble is, we never read between chapter 13 and 14 of Saul ever turning to God and asking for forgiveness for the actions that he's done in chapter 13 that lead to his rejection. We never read of him saying, Lord, restore my relationship. Instead, what does he do? He goes about creating the image of looking like he's all okay. It's a painful question. But do we at times allow or want to make ourselves look like, even as God's people, like we have an okay relationship with God, but there's a bit of unresolved business in the background? Do we settle for making ourselves appear like everything's okay? Now that's, in some ways, it's part of our culture, isn't it? We are brought up and we feel the pressures constantly around us of making sure that we look okay, that we sound okay, that we appear okay. And sometimes we need that in order to be able to function. That's not necessarily a wrong thing. But underneath there was a problem for Saul. And the thing is, and it's not that, and the issue is that Saul isn't even really trying to address it, is it? We don't read of him sitting there with the priest, calling on him to offer sacrifices, or calling on him to ask God, or to deal with God on his behalf. He just sat there doing nothing. Content to just seemingly pull a veil, a scene, a picture over everything. I sadly remember when leading a team on beach mission, we had a teenager come in the team, and she was saying how sadly it felt like in her church there were just loads of people who, so long as they were there on a Sunday, so long as they sang the right hymns, they looked the right way, nobody really cared about what was going on spiritually underneath. And here's the sadness about that. As God's people, we don't need to pretend that we have God's blessing or his peace or his nearness. Saul was going to have to do something. He doesn't, and he ends up being separated even further from God. Thing is, as God's people, what do we know? We know his blessing, don't we? That's what Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 1 verse 3. He says, in Christ we have every spiritual blessing. And what does that entail? Well, define everything. It's tricky, isn't it? It says we've got every blessing from God. We know his peace, his presence. We have a sense of his hope. We have the joy of being able to come to him for forgiveness over and over again. We're able to really know his presence and his hand to be with us. We don't have to pretend that things are okay between us and God. Because through the Lord Jesus Christ, they really are. Whether sometimes we might not feel like it, and maybe that's because we need to resolve something, deal with some sin, or a relationship with God in our own hearts. We shouldn't want to try and just ignore it, bury it, pull a sort of a veil over it and say, well, so long as I look okay. We should be concerned about our relationship with God. And we want to make sure that we enjoy the benefits of it, not just portray the image of that. And therefore we see with Jonathan how that begins to take shape. So the second heading is savoring. Savoring, you know what it is, don't you? To take a piece of food and you put it in your mouth, and the taste and the flavour, it is just, it's fantastic. You like to keep it in your mouth and just enjoy that flavour for a moment. Maybe you do that particularly with a square of chocolate, maybe in an evening. It might be more than one piece of chocolate, I guess, but you enjoy the taste, we enjoy the flavour of it, and we keep it, and we think, well, this is something that I can delight in. Well, we find Jonathan has this attitude and approach towards God, and a key part of it in this passage is that we understand that what Jonathan does is secret to begin with. Chapter 14, verse 1. We're told that one day Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armour-bearer, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side," but he did not tell his father. Verse 3, at the end of it, no one was aware that Jonathan had left. And again in verse 17, we're told that Saul wants the people counted, and when they did, they found that Jonathan and his armour-bearer who were not there. Nobody knew what Jonathan and his armour-bearer were doing. This is like a secret covert operation. And I think that in some ways that just shows us how much Jonathan understood about his dad. He understands where Saul is, that though there's an enemy on the other side, there's a problem to be dealt with, and God had told them to care for the land, Saul isn't taking the initiative. Saul is just sitting there, waiting and waiting. Jonathan, on the other hand, is active. He wants to see what he can do for God. And what we find is actually verse 6 is probably just an extension of what Jonathan says in verse 3. But verse 6 of chapter 14 is just staggering, isn't it? Jonathan says to his armour-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." What a brilliant statement of faith from Jonathan. Nothing can hinder the Lord. There is nothing that's going to stop God from working. If God wants to rescue the people of Israel from the Philistines, it doesn't matter how many there are, God can do it. There is no limit, Jonathan says, to the power of God, to the strength of him. He says, look, it's going to be just you and me to begin with, mate, but actually we don't need to worry, because if it's just us and we have God on our side, well, it's going to be a success. Well, is this just a little bit of youthful recklessness? Now, young men, speaking as one, can be prone to moments of recklessness, thinking that this looks a great idea, let's just go for it, without considering the potential implications or outcomes or dangers of what is going on. But Jonathan isn't reckless, is he? It isn't reckless to trust God. It isn't reckless to be convinced of God's power and ability to do things that sound and seem utterly impossible. And Jonathan, in this, sets a few tests and measures, doesn't he? In verse 9, Jonathan says, "Come on then, we'll cross over." And he says in verse 9, "If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be the sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." Jonathan says, the test is this: if God is with us, we'll go. If we have no sense of God being with us, we're going to stay. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to go and seek to cause any trouble or attack. The test is we want to know a sign, an element of God's presence and blessing with us. Jonathan wasn't a man who was just going to sit around doing nothing. But if he did do something, he wanted to make sure that it was with God, under God's hand, with his blessing. Not just, well, this feels like a good idea. In that sense, Jonathan here is a little bit like, Moses saying to God, "Give me a sign to show the people that I'm going to lead them out of Egypt." It's like Gideon saying laying out the fleece, saying, "Lord, if you want me to do this, make it wet or make it dry." So I want a clear indication that this is your hands. Isn't that true for all of us? in whatever we do. We want to know, don't we, that God is with us, that our thoughts, our hopes, our intentions, that they are actually the will of God. And many times, God reveals that to us. Maybe opportunities close. Things are postponed or stopped or hindered, or something else crops up or comes in that is perhaps better or more right for us to do. We know that, don't we? Because we've seen that time and time again in our own lives and experiences. But as they climb up and they head towards the Philistine outpost, they are told by the Philistines, come on up, we're going to teach you a lesson. And we can all imagine the lesson that they're hoping on teaching Jonathan. Jonathan and his armour bearer are not expecting, they're not expecting them to be able to go back to the camp at all. We'll deal with you. And why they, you can imagine the tone they're saying it. Jonathan is a young man. These are going to be seasoned, heavily armoured, well-drilled Philistine soldiers. They weren't just a bunch of rabble. But here's the thing. Jonathan and his armour-bearer were always going to win because God was with them. And we see the armour-bearer shares the same faith, doesn't he? The armour-bearer is just keen to work with Jonathan on that. Verse 7, the armour-bearer says to Jonathan, do all that you have in mind. The armour-bearer said, go ahead, I'm with you heart and soul. Whatever you believe about God, whatever confidence you have, Jonathan, I have the same. Here are two men who are attempting to do something boldly and confidently, trusting in God. Brings to mind the well-known quote from William Carey. Expect great things from God. Attempt great things for God. It's a simple question for us, isn't it? Do we have at times, as his people, as a church, as individuals, a bold vision for how we could serve God, for what God might enable us or help us to do? Now, it doesn't always mean that it's going to take place. Jonathan was well prepared for the answer to come back, well, no, don't go. We need to be prepared for that too at times. But there does have to be a point where we have to ask the question, is this right for me to do? Is this a right avenue of service? Is this a right degree of mission for me to be involved in? Is this a right step for me to take, maybe in my career? And to ask the question, is this not what I want, but is this what God wants? Is this the right time? I might have the inclination, I might have the energy, I might have the resources, I might have the capacity to cope with it. But is this God's will? And the answer comes back for Jonathan, yes it is. In fact, what we find is that God was going to be pleased to use the boldness and the confidence that Jonathan had in him to move and to act. You look when we get to verse 15, we read this, that then panic struck the whole army. So that's not just the outpost, but the whole army who were camped obviously a little bit further away. Those in the camp and field, those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. There is naturally no way that two men are going to have an impact on an entire Philistine army. But the point is, God used them to bring about his purposes. Because people with God is always a majority. Saul was sat there doing nothing. Jonathan thought, I could do something for God. If it is God's will, this is going to work and it is going to succeed. He had a great view and understanding of God. He wasn't held back by it. You see, when we do things that are part of God's will, that God intends, there is a blessing to be known in doing it. God accompanies the heart of Jonathan, doesn't he? And Jonathan gets to know that God and see God working in a way beyond what Jonathan had even imagined. I mean, did Jonathan go into this imagining that he was going to cause an incredible victory over the Philistines? Well, no, I don't think Jonathan did. But Jonathan went into it knowing that God could do it. He wasn't resting and dependent on him. And it's a question and something that we need to consider and look at how we apply to our own situations and how we apply that as a church and fellowship going forward as well. But we have to say, do I have a delight and a confidence in the power of God? And are we prepared to do things that might seem hard? And for Jonathan and his armour bearers, they're scaling up that cliff to face a Philistine outpost. That looked pretty risky. But are we prepared to do things that might have a cost, might have a risk, but we do them because they are what we are convinced that the Lord has his hand upon. We need to be praying for that and seeking for that as individuals and as a church too. And then thirdly, we have spurring. I can still remember two of the guys that I sat beside when I was doing my GCSE courses, particularly maths and science. Why? Well, because actually I got on. Not only did I get on really well with them, they were really nice guys to spend time beside, but I enjoyed spending time with them because they were really keen. They were really conscientious. They loved the topics that we were doing, and we would often sit there together in maths and in science, two different guys, and we would talk about the topics that we were going through, and we would discuss it together. We would work out the problems and help each other, and it was a real benefit. Particularly in science, the guy I sat beside was really, really clever, so it was really helpful. I'm indebted to him, I'm sure, for passing chemistry at GCSE, because he really helped to explain some things that I just couldn't quite get. But there was something helpful about sitting next to people who had a passion and a desire and an enthusiasm for what we were doing. And that is true, isn't it? It is infectious. When you find someone who loves something, who is interested in something, well, you hopefully can't help but sort of catch something of their excitement as well. Jonathan and his armour-bearers' actions here have that spurring, that encouraging effect on the people of Israel. It's a bit of a slow start, but in verse 16, Saul's lookouts at Gibeah, just across the valley, a few miles away, they're looking and they see the Philistine army, we're told in verse 16, melting away in all directions. They can see these Philistines, they're just running, and they haven't got a clue as to what's going on. So Saul says, well, let's at least get the army together, let's count here, let's see. Have a detachment of our guys secretly gone and fought, and they find that Jonathan and the armour-bearer are missing. And then Saul kind of does nothing, really. He doesn't go, whoa, great, Jonathan's taken the lead, he's obviously he's acting here, let's go support him. Saul instead turns around and goes, now we'll do the spiritual thing. Now we can see that something's really going on. Let's do something spiritual. I'll stop just sitting under my tree here, giving a nice impression. And he turns to Ahijah and says, bring the ark of God. Now we're going to cast lots before the Lord. And Ahijah, I want you to ask God, is this the time for me to go and attack the Philistines? Should I now do this? And what's fascinating is, whilst they're talking, verse 19, while Saul was still talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. The simple thing is Saul sees there is something that is obviously momentous going on. God is obviously moving and working. The prayer's already been offered. He's just going to go. He can see something that's exciting taking place. God's dealing and removing the enemies, and he wants to be a part of it. And the army, with the 600 men with Saul, they go and charge into it, and they find in verse 20 there is total confusion. The Philistines, they weren't sort of reckless people. They were an army. They were drilled in that to some degree. And yet obviously God had worked and was causing this to come about. But it isn't just Saul that's then spurred into action. We also find, quite shockingly from verse 21, that there were some Israelites, some Hebrews, who had previously been amongst the Philistines. They went over to their camp, we're told in verse 21. They'd left the Israelites. They obviously thought they had a better chance of living if they stayed amongst the Philistines. And so they went to be with them. They thought they were the more likely winners of the battle. But even they start turning against the Philistines. And then the Israelites who've been hiding in the hills, well, they hear the Philistines are running and they go, oh, we'll go and join the battle too. We're not so terrified now. There's a chance of success. We'll go and join them as well. We could be inclined to look at these Israelites and go, cool, they're pretty fickle and weak, aren't they? They just flip-flop from side to side. Are they going to do something? Are they with Israel? Are they against Israel? Do they even really care? If they'd actually all stayed with Saul, maybe the Philistine army would have been dealt with sooner. Well, I think actually in some ways we should show some grace to them here. Standing up for God's ways, God's people, God's rule is never easy, is it? Don't we know as ourselves, when in the face of challenge, in the face of difficulty, we can be prone, can't we, to back down or want to shy away, to hide away, to not be seen and counted necessarily as being a Christian, or at least not quite so clearly. God's people in every age and generation have found their own challenges of standing up or not standing up. Here's the thing, when they started to see someone acting for God, living by faith, living courageously, what did it do to them? It made them say, I want to do that too. I can't sit back. Their actions motivated the others of God's people, to live and serve for God too. That's what we were thinking about with the children earlier, wasn't it? A good example is helpful. It is worth copying. In fact, don't we find it encouraging when we see one another living faithfully for God, seeking to serve Him? Doesn't it make us want to do it as well? Hopefully we don't feel jealous that people are doing things that perhaps we might want to do. Hopefully it should encourage us to seek to serve God in the ways that we can, to motivate us in our own spiritual lives. Didn't we find it odd? And don't those of you still at home find it odd singing hymns in your own home? And wasn't it harder singing the hymns? Maybe some of you didn't necessarily sing out at all because it just felt odd and out of place and weird. It's easier, isn't it, when we're singing together? We find that encouragement. It's good for us to worship God together. Did we find that when we spent more time apart, that perhaps our own spiritual appetites weren't quite so strong? That they struggled, that we felt ourselves just sort of shrinking, and maybe coming back into to being in the church, we found it almost a bit intense. But it's been good for us, hasn't it? It's been helpful to sort of revive our spiritual longings and interests and attitudes and appetites. And that happens more and more as the church spend more time together, as we enjoy each other's company and we see each other's lives. That's why, isn't it? In Hebrews chapter 10, we picked a verse that we used for what we called our home groups, Hebrews 10:24. And that verse there says, let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. The whole point of the whole point of those gatherings were to encourage one another. How well are we doing that at the church at the moment? How well are we living out our lives so that others amongst the fellowship might see our faith might see our confidence in God, and that we might act as an encouragement to each other to press on. We have, don't we, some wonderful examples amongst us. As we look at each other's lives and as we spend time talking with each other more, we discover more things. Don't we delight when we see that faith? Jonathan and his armour bearer were used to not only defeat an enemy, but to bring a people back into serving God, to spark something that really should have been there. And isn't, as we were saying with the children, shouldn't our greatest desire not just spark each other to copy each other, but to encourage one another to copy Jesus? Because as Paul writes in Romans chapter 8, he says that God wants us to be conformed to the image of his Son. He wants us to look more like him. He wants us to to live more like him. And that's the purpose, isn't it, of looking at each other's lives. We might see more of Jesus, and we might see in each other how we could then live more like Jesus because of the examples that others are already setting for us. This passage reminds us that we can know and enjoy God's blessing because of Jesus. We don't have to try and pretend. We can know it. And we should seek his will and boldly do what he calls us to do, despite the cost, despite maybe the risk. And that as we do so, we should encourage one another to continue in the faith and to serve God with our time and days. Let's